Okay, thank you all for joining today. I think we'll just dive right in. We have an hour today, so I want to be very efficient with your time too. But before we do anything else, it would be very helpful if we could just establish a recurring schedule. So we're looking at meeting like twice a month, and I do request that it be um every other, it's the week that's opposite of the regular IAC meetings. So it's a lot for me to prepare for an IAC, a full IAC meeting, and then do all the subs in the same week. So looking at specifically what times would work for you for, let's see here, the week of February 3rd through 7th. And then if that time also works for you for 2 weeks later as well.
That Wednesday morning for both of those for me works. The 5th would be just fine, and then the 19th is.
I've got a 10 o'clock, so I could do 9 to 10, or I could do like 11 to 12, 11 to 1. I don't know if you're looking for a 1 hour slot or 2 hour slot.
I do suspect that we probably will have to start with a couple like 90-minute meetings if we have the time to do it. If you don't, we can figure that out. But if you do, I think that would allow us to get through more work in that limited time.
If we did a 90, I can do the hours fine, that 9 to 10, but if we need to go to 90 minutes, I need to go to 11 on both of those days as well. So I could do 11 to whatever, that's fine.
11 to 12:30?
Sure, that works for me.
Yeah, that would be great. Okay, let me just note that down. I'll follow up with a calendar invite for you all. But okay, that is helpful. Thank you for that. Let's see, Wednesday.
So it would be on the 5th, and then the 19th, and then every other week from there going forward, or is it slightly different?
It kind of, it's more limited duration. So 5th, 19th, March 5th, then March 19th. I think we'll hopefully just those 4 would be enough.
Okay.
Because we do have to have the recommendations ready for the board by the end of March. So,
Right.
That's what we're looking at here. That is very helpful. Thank you so much for that. And I think that hopefully it will be the end of our marathon scheduling sessions, because I know it's been a lot. But now we have everything kind of on a recurring basis too, which helps. So thank you for that. Okay, so then jumping in, I thought we would just, so I just want to clarify that, I am really here to offer support for you all. So I have a subject matter expertise, and I can also like offer research and data to you all, but it's really your subcommittee. So when I make these suggestions going forward about like the times to meet or the scope of the work, I'm just making suggestions, but it's really your decisions to make too. And of course, like we're deferring to what you all prefer here. So just gonna note that you all are both here, Kari and great. So I thought we'd talk a little bit of time about the scope of the subcommittee and the core values and parameters, just to make sure we're all on the same page. We don't spend a lot of time. Oh, we lost Kari.
We did.
Let's see. Hopefully he'll dial back in a second. There he goes. Okay.
I'm back. Sorry about that. Internet trouble.
No worries. I thought we'd just take a little bit of time to talk about the scope and the core values and parameters, so everyone's working from the same page. Just to frame the conversation, I'm going to give you like my idea, but again, this is my suggestion. It's really your what you all are thinking that's guiding us here. So for the scope, I thought the scope would be more along the lines of what are the limits for actual donors? And so if an individual is giving, if an organization is giving, what are their contribution limits? What are the limits for like loans? And for self-giving too. And then, inherent in that is like who can give as well. Because many programs have different limits for for different kinds of donors too. And then also like who's allowed to give within that too. So it's like, are certain organizations allowed to give and certain organizations not allowed to give? Are like, all individuals allowed to give, or only individuals, for instance, who are registered voters? So that would be the scope. And I think like we're not including, oh, and we're also including the definition of small donor committees in the scope as well too. We're not including in-kind donations in the scope because another subcommittee is working on that. And we're not including like the overall match amount that the program provides because the full committee will work on that. One other thing that we'll probably be looking at is spending limits too. So some programs do have an overall spending limit for campaigns. Do we want one as well? And then what are the spending constrictions to, like, what are the things that we're allowed to spend, candidates are allowed to spend money on, not allowed to spend money on? So again, I'm just putting that as a draft.
In this subcommittee? We're doing that in this subcommittee?
Yeah, we'll do that in this subcommittee. I know it sounds like a lot, but actually when we take it piece by piece, I think it'll be pretty straightforward in some ways. So anyway, that's my draft, just to frame the conversation. But what do you all feel like the scope is? Is there anything that we should include that we haven't, or we should exclude that we thought we were including?
I mean, that all looks fine to me.
I'll just say, I mean, I think that's certainly a good start. Those are definitely things that I wanted to chat about. And I would imagine as we start working through some of these questions, there might be a few things that pop up, but as long as we just have some flexibility, if we find something that we feel like we need to discuss, we can discuss it. But other than that, I think this is a really good starting point.
Yeah. The only thing I would add to that mix is, as I said in our one of our earlier meetings, to me, the contribution limits and the match algorithm or match structure are tightly connected, right? Mm-hmm. If you have a very low match, you have to have a high contribution limit. If you have a very low contribution limit, you have to have a high match. Because candidates need the money to run campaigns, they need to communicate. And then I guess that's the main thing I would say, is I'm always thinking about how can we make sure that voters are served by getting material from candidates, and that democracy is served by having candidates be the primary voice for themselves and not being reliant on third parties. I've worked on a lot of candidate campaigns. I've worked on some, third-party independent expenditures. To me, democracy is best served when candidates speak for themselves, not rely on other people to speak for them.
Yeah,
I think voters are best served that way.
And I would totally agree with that, because that's, if we saw this in City of Portland races, and we see this in all these other races, if you clamp down too much on campaign contributions and you pull it away from the candidate, then it just becomes an independent expenditure war. And that becomes far less democratic than what you actually have when all of the campaign contributions are carefully monitored and shown through Orstar, and you see where the money's coming from, how it's going to the candidate, then the candidate can spend it on themselves. It's when we get it, I mean, just look in Washington and what happens up there. It's nothing but nonstop independent expenditures up there. And that's because they clamp down on campaign finance contribution limits. And so, it's a fine line of how you're controlling all that. But and it really does become problematic at that point and becomes far less democratic at the end of the day.
And the best example, it's 30 years old, but still 1996 was the one cycle when Oregon had, for the legislature, a $100 contribution limit. And a good friend of mine actually ran one of those campaigns for Brian Deckert. Remember that name? They had no money. And they just had no money. It was like, one staff person trying to get the candidate to go door knocking. That's the whole campaign. No mailers, no advertising. They didn't have digital back then anyway. And the whole operation was run. In the end, the caucus operation moved to OEA, which ran a massive independent expenditure campaign. You might recognize some of the names involved there. That independent expenditure campaign was run in the basement of OEA by Tobias Reed, Phil Donovan, Rob Wagner, Martin Taylor, Kristen Leonard. I mean, like, they became the power players of Oregon politics because they ran that independent expenditure campaign 30 years ago. And the candidates had no say. And that was my first cycle in politics in Oregon on the Hooley campaign. And I saw it up close and personal. And like, that's a huge mistake, is to clamp down so tight that the candidates are basically spectators in the process.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And I think we've actually incorporated in the next agenda item, which is discussing core values and parameters. So thank you for naming those. And it's totally fine. So I'm glad we were able to name those too. Just going back to what you said earlier, Kari, I think you're totally right that this conversation is very linked to the conversation around how much matching funds we're providing and how much matching funds candidates can receive. I think we do have that set aside for the full committee to discuss, just because that question informs like every other subcommittee work too. So we wanted to make sure everyone's kind of working from the same information at the same time. But yeah, and I think that's fortunately like why the subcommittees are meeting at the same time as the full committees, is that like if we get a sense of where the full committee wants to go on, the match amounts, then you all can in this subcommittee can like adjust accordingly too.
Do I understand correctly that the county charter includes this, I guess, a $603 limit, and so we can't recommend, because the county commission can't adopt limits above that. Is that right?
Yeah, actually, let's talk about that. Because we did some analysis on this question, and I think one challenging piece of designing this policy is we do have a significant constraint from the charter. So I shared with you the charter language, and you all have that too. And I'm just going to make sure I'm on the right tab. Okay. So yeah, I shared with you the charter language. So it is $603 per donor. And that donor means individual political committee other than small donor committee. And that limit is adjusted for inflation on January 1st of odd years. So it was just adjusted, a couple weeks ago. It's based on the state's definition too of what a contributor means, or contribution means. Unlimited donations are allowed from small donor committees. So the charter does have that provision. However, the charter also says a small donor committee is a committee that does not accept more than $122 per individual per calendar year. And I don't know the in-depth bank accounts of a lot of these organizations, but my memory from the small donor elections program at the city was not a lot of organizations met the SDC requirement. And that requirement was $250 per donor would make an SDC. And so this one's even lower than that.
So on that, I saw somewhere in your email that we couldn't change that number. Why can't we change that number? And why does it not align from county to city to state? Like that is part of the heart of the problem in this whole process, is the small donor doesn't even align with what an individual can give. If you had a band of 10 people that wanted to give individual contributions, they could, but those same 10 people couldn't band together and give contributions of the same amount as a group. So that, in my mind, literally makes zero sense. And it's different in the city of Portland, which is in, for the most part, Multnomah County. So please explain to me on some level why any of that makes, because it doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, I totally understand that. And to clarify, organizations, just as a caveat, organization, like if 10 people get together and they do want to contribute, they can create a small donor committee. It's just that their contributions have to be $122 or less, which is, I understand, like a small amount for a lot.
But they could all individually give the $600, right? The new contribution. So if we were a group of 3 people, I could give my $600, you could give your $600, and Kari could give the $600. But if we formed a political action committee and called it a small donor committee, now all of a sudden that number's changed. That makes zero sense.
Well, the theory would be is that I might, for example, create a small donor committee, county residents for truth and justice, and I get 10,000 people in there, and
Sure.
they all give $100, right? And now I've got $1 million in that account, and I can give the whole million to a county commission candidate.
That's right. That's correct.
It's
And then going back to your other question, the definitions are different because this was, what we're talking about now was adopted into the Multnomah County Charter, and that only applies to Multnomah County elections, which are candidates for county, for commission, and also for Multnomah County Auditor and Multnomah County Sheriff. The city's elections are governed by the city charter, which, of course, was like amended in 2022, and that's why we had all those, we had a completely different style of elections last
The
year.
city learned from the county's mistakes, Marshall.
Yeah, and
that still didn't fix the problem.
yeah, and the language is so that's why the definitions are different. And there's actually one critical piece. I think the most critical piece here is that the city language, the city charter language, is a little bit more open than the county charter language. The county charter language is what we're talking about now. The city charter language has all these limits and restrictions, but says a public financing program can set its own rules. And that's why the small donor elections program at the city was able to have like a higher number for, small donor committees. It was able to have like a high amount for, it could set any kind of in-kind limit. It could set any kind of loan limit. They had an exemption written in there. And we at the county do not have an exemption written in there, which is challenging. So that's why the definitions are a little different. So just going back to what I'm giving you an overview of what the charter says. We talked about the small donor committee definition. No donations are allowed from any other kind of entity. Contribution limits and contribution limits do not apply to funds issued by government systems of public funding. So what that means is that the public financing program, if it wants to give candidates like $90,000, just to give a number there, $90,000, it can do that. That's not a violation of the $603 limit. So the county can give more than the 603 limit is what that exception means. It also does, interestingly enough, carve out donations of rooms, phones, internet access used by a candidate committee free or reduced charge, which means an organization or an individual can provide, an in-kind donation of like an office space to a candidate, and that does not violate the limit.
Does.
What do you say?
Unlike Portland, where that became a subject of some controversy.
Yes. And so there was a little bit of, not gonna lie, there was a little bit of relief to see that was an exception in the county charter. So, and this is the challenging part, unfortunately. And the charter language is, it can be, and to be clear, the charter can be changed, but only by a vote of the county voters. It can't be changed by the county commission. So that is a significant constraint. The charter language doesn't say anything about letting donors give above the limit in certain circumstances. So as we said before, the city charter language carves out rules set by their public funding program. We don't have any kind of carve out like that. So that means, unfortunately, we cannot set limits on donations or loans that are higher than the 603. And that is a major challenge for how we build this policy. Basically the guidance is we can set restrictions that are less than the charter. We can make our program more restrictive than the county charter allows, but we can't make it less restrictive than the county charter. And unfortunately also, and I went back and forth about this, we cannot change the definition of small donor committee. The state has its own definition that will, they passed a big campaign finance reform bill, I think in the last regular scheduled session, if I remember right. And that does not, Wait, oh, 24. Okay, thank you. But that does not go into effect until 2027. And this program is decided, is going to start in 2026. So the state has its own definition of what a small donor committee looks like. It won't go into effect though until after our first election cycle.
And once we get to 2027, does that state definition constrain our definition? Are we subject to state law?
It's a little. So here's what this means. It's a little complicated, but essentially, what the bill says is that, or what the law says is that organizations or individuals can have to choose between running a county small donor committee or a state small donor committee. And because an organization cannot control both. And so if a county has a small donor committee set up, like, we do under our charter, an organization, like for instance, OEA would have to decide between, do we want to have a state small donor committee or a county small donor committee? And the analysis says that we're expecting more organizations to choose the state small donor committee because the state small donor committee has a higher threshold. I think they allow for like up to 250 per donor, whereas the county charter says it's 122. So organizations have a right to choose, but most of them will likely choose the state small donor committee definition, which means they cannot be a county small donor committee. They can still give to county candidates, but it won't be on the unlimited amount that they are allowed to in the county. Does that make sense? I know it's kind of a complicated step.
It's dumb, but I understand what you meant.
Yeah. So my understanding is that there is some discussions in the legislature around changing the bill and changing the law in this current session. I think it was felt that there was a need for some fixes. And so, that could all change based on what the legislature does this session. But that's the understanding now.
Got it. I know,
Yeah.
Marshall, one of your big concerns was the small donor committee.
It's a huge issue, like it really is, and it's even more compounded with Multnomah County in general. I mean, it literally the arbitrary number that they picked for these small donor committees is a little ridiculous. So, and it really restricts a lot of organizations that have come together to, spend money politically. It restricts them ridiculously, and it doesn't make a ton of sense to me. So, but it doesn't sound like we can do a whole lot with it without taking it to the voters. So,
Yeah, and of course, like the county commissioners can refer out a charter amendment, or it could be collected by signatures. A charter amendment can be put on the ballot, and maybe like the language would say like there's an exception for public financing programs. Public financing programs can set their own limits or something like that. And it can certainly address multiple provisions within the charter. I'm not suggesting now, I think it's kind of beyond the scope. Well, actually, no, I wouldn't say this. Like, the full IEC could make a recommendation if that's what it believed would be necessary. But I think, for the scope of what we're doing now, I would say that is an avenue for how the charter could be changed. But unfortunately, we do have this constraint in place unless the charter is changed, or unless there's something happens at the legislature, because what the legislature passes can override a county charter. Other than that, unfortunately, we do have a limit here. And the limit essentially is 603 for almost all kinds of donations, unless it's a small donor committee under those restrictive rules we just talked about too.
So going back to values, I also believe that in addition to candidates having enough money to use their own voice, I think candidates should be able to effectively have some choices as to how they run their campaigns. I know for example, in the Portland City races, there were some candidates that aggressively went after $20 contributions. They're going to go, low and wide. really rack up the matching thing. And there were some controversies how some of them chose to do that, but that was a strategy. And then there were other candidates that, I'm just not a grassroots kind of person. I'm going to go out and get those 350s one after the other and just pile those up. And maybe there's some matching, but really my goal is those 350s because I have a smaller group of supporters that have more capacity. And again, to me, that's why the limit and the matching mechanism are intimately connected. Because if we say, for example, the limit is $600, 603, that's great, but we're only matching the first 20, and in the first 20 is 9-1. And that's one kind of a system, right? Versus we're going to say, well, okay, but if you want to take or we're going to go, we're going to match the first 200, but only match it 3-1. But if you do that though, then you voluntarily self-limiting to that to 300 or something or 200, whatever the case might be. Like to me, there's a piece of this says in addition to the hard cap and the matchable, you could also say there's a voluntary cap that exists if you're choosing matchable, right? You could say, it's $603 if you opt out of public financing entirely. But if you opt in, then you get this really generous matching system and your cap comes way down, maybe to the 300 the city has or something. The challenge that the city had was the hard cap was there for the matchable folks too. And there's no reason for anyone to opt out of the public matching system, which maybe has some value. The only people that opted out were the ones who got into the race like the day before the deadline for matching. Like Harrison Cass is one of them. And so I guess I'm not sure I'm not going to land this particular logical plane, but the idea is for me, it's like what I want to encourage is lots of small dollar giving, but I don't want to do it at the expense of people who want to choose to run a campaign that runs the voter approved limits. Frankly, I think the voter approved limit of 603 is too low. I'd prefer to be at the federal limit and the state limit, both of which are currently 3,300. I think harmonizing all the way across the board. Now, I wouldn't want to match all the way up there. In fact, I wouldn't even want to give somebody who's getting $3,300 donations. I wouldn't want to give any matching dollars. To me, that'd be like you'd have to opt out of that system into a lower limit system if we could do that. But again, we're constrained by the county charter.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Go ahead. I was just going to follow up with that and say, speaking with a lot of the city candidates and looking at these, folks that were actively trying to hit these 250 threshold, and what was the next one up, 750 or something like that. It was a real struggle for a lot of them. And what I would ultimately say in that is, even if you hit the 750 threshold to get, another chunk of change from the city, you're talking about hitting 750 voters. How in the world, when you're looking at these giant districts, are you telling me that you're speaking to 750 voters is really getting your voice out there and really getting your message out to the massive number of people that need to hear that? Absolutely, door knocking and grassroots campaigns can swing an election, but just getting your name out there and getting people to understand who you are and what you are in a world where people are so apathetic in general when it comes to politics, to me, that we're aiming at this ridiculously low number to try to say, oh, look at us, we're out organizing people because we talked to 250 people who gave us $20 a piece. To me, that makes zero sense. And I'm exactly with Kari on this, in that match it all up in a way that allows people to get a mailer out so that people can see voices, or have an advertisement on campaign or on TV where the voters can actually see and learn about these folks. I think you're asking for a lot from people. There are certain people that will go and look up candidates and do those things, but that percentage of the population is very, very small, right? It is very, very small. You have to use the medias, the social medias, the TV, the radio, the things of that nature to get those messages out to folks. Otherwise, it just doesn't work. And we saw that in the city. Look at who won in the city. And if you had name recognition, Dan Ryan, Loretta Smith, folks of that nature, they have such an easier avenue to getting elected than folks who've never run for office before. Mm-hmm. So.
Yeah, I think what I'm hearing is that it's you have to reach a large number of voters, and it costs money to do that, and you really need to be able to raise enough, whether it's through high contribution limits or whether it's through high matching funds. You have to be able to raise enough in order to get your message out, and otherwise, like, what are we achieving here? And so that's a really important message to hear. And thank you for bringing it up. And, I was reflecting on this earlier, and I think like the value, a lot of programs, and I have this table on the next page which kind of shows it, but a lot of programs have contribution limits. They have a match, like the limits for people who participate in the matching programs. Those limits are often lower than the limits for people who are not part of it.
Sure.
And that was, as Kari was saying, that was the case at the city. At 2024, the contribution limit for people who participated was $350. For people who did not participate, it was $579. And so it usually is lower. And the goal on that is to like kind of shift candidate behavior. You want to encourage candidates to spend time, with every community and raising donations from every corner of the city. And for people who are based in communities that are low income, that they can like raise enough in order to win. And so there is like a value in changing candidate behavior, quote unquote, and like encouraging or raise from low dollar donations, which is why matching program limits are often lower than like the limits for non-participants. The goal, so that's the goal, is to change candidate behavior. I will say that at the same time though, like the candidate behaviors already has to be changed because of what's in the county charter. Like they already cannot raise big donations. They already cannot, they're already very limited in what they can raise from like, people who aren't individuals too. And so they're already focused on raising small dollar donations if they're running for county commission, just because the limit is pretty low there too. So I kind of like, I think that's like impacting how you all set the limits here. Is like, what are the values that are trying to be achieved? And the value is definitely like raising enough money to be able to be competitive and get your voice out. And another value is making sure like they're focused on everyday people living in the city. It does seem like the county, to me, it seems like the county charter is already
Right. There's no
constraining them to do
full
that.
night $2 million contribution here.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that's what I'm saying. So let's move on. Let's talk about the table here I have. So I went through a lot of the programs. There's, I think, 30 plus programs, and I chose a selection of them. I can always get you more information if you want more. If you want to like know what another city or state does, I'm happy to circle back with that info.
In this table, these are all limits under matching programs.
Yes, and so sometimes the limit is lower. Oftentimes it's lower, but there are a few occasions where the limit is the same as what it is for people outside of the program too. And then I have it kind of broken down. We have the contribution limits that they run under, and then they have the limits that the candidates can give to themselves, and then the limits on loans too.
And
of course we have that
on self donations, those are always voluntary when people opt into a matching program, right?
What I mean by self is like what the candidate gives to their own campaign.
Right, which cannot be constrained under Citizens United at all, ever, unless they voluntarily do it because they're getting a matching system, right?
Let me confirm that. I don't want to give you the wrong information, so yeah. I'm going to note that, and I can circle back on that too.
Yeah, my read of Citizens United is when you're doing free speech on behalf of yourself, it's unlimited. Can't be constrained.
Let's see.
But I don't know.
Okay, I'm going to put that down.
Yeah, that becomes problematic when you have folks that have unlimited wealth and resources at their disposal to run for office because, hey, look at that. I can spend whatever I want. We see it all the time. Like candidates kick themselves another $50,000 to $100,000 loan.
Yeah.
And right. I mean, they're not having to go out and get campaign contributions from anybody at that point.
Yeah. I worked for a congressional candidate who hated call time, hated fundraising, and you'd say like, Friday afternoon, I'm going golfing with my buddies. Like, oh, you can spend the time to ask your buddies for max out donations. He's like, no, they've already given. Like, well, what are we doing on Friday? He's like, you should be doing call time. He's like, how much should I raise during call time? 10 grand. He's like, all right, there's a $10,000 check. I'm going golfing. They did it almost every Friday of the campaign. You know, rich guy running for office. You know, I think,
its finest.
and I think that's why the matching programs are so powerful, because it does give folks who do not have personal wealth the ability to compete with the person who has personal wealth.
Yeah.
Right.
And
so one thing that you could do, for example, is you could say, here's the matching logic, right? You get, the 6-to-1 match for your first $100 or whatever you do. But if another candidate in the race goes above some number, they put in more than $100,000 of their own money, then your multiplier goes up. Now it becomes a 10-to-1, right? Which creates a disincentive for that other guy to go above whatever the sum is.
There's a complication with that.
Is the budget side of it, right?
Well, It's actually, unfortunately, that was that exact provision was struck down by the Supreme Court. Arizona used to have that provision, and then there was a case where it was like Arizona Free Enterprise.
Right.
The Supreme Court ruled on, I think, in 2011, which those trigger provisions were struck down.
Yeah, they were coercive.
Yeah.
Damn it.
I think there's like there's other avenues to pursue. Maybe like if a candidate like applies for the right to raise their limits or applies for additional matching funds, but it's not a trigger provision, that might be okay, and that's something I can look into.
And that was struck down that Arizona provision was struck down by a federal court, right?
Supreme Court, yeah, U.S. Supreme Court.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, can't go higher than that. So,
okay.
So I think we are limited in that, but there might be sometimes programs do have supplemental funds. They have an avenue of giving the candidates if there's like, if their opponents are like outraising them by significant funds or something like that. So just going back to the table here, these are the contribution limits, the self limits, and then the loan limits. The counties that have an asterisk in them, like Baltimore County, and then San Francisco, Washington, D.C., their populations are, in Denver too, their populations are around equal size here, because some of these communities are much smaller, like Berkeley and Long Beach, California, are much smaller than Portland, and obviously New York City and LA are much bigger. So I want to give you a range, but I do think it's like important to keep in mind, like, what makes sense for population size, and like, i.e., a media market like Portland has.
San Francisco, with that $150 limit, I want to spend a weekend driving Gavin Newsom around Portland, Oregon, raising money, because of that 150 limit made it so hard for him to raise money down there. And he's up here raising money at 150 at pop too. Like, again, example of, you make it too tight of a limit and people are going to go far afield to raise that money.
Yeah.
They do weird things. Like, it serves the voters of San Francisco nothing when the guy running for mayor is in Portland, Oregon, raising money, even at the 150 level.
Yeah. And actually, I think on that one, I was reading the San Francisco law again yesterday, and I think I might have misread it, so that might be on me. I think actually the limit is $500 for candidates to participate in a program. So I personally apologize, I might have gotten that information wrong. But in general, these are what the limits look like. And of course, again, these are usually lower than what the full limits are if you run outside the program. Another thing that stands out to me is that a lot of programs have different limits for different offices. So like, the mayoral candidate might have a higher limit than a council candidate. The way Portland did, which actually I thought like has some benefits to it, was Portland just had the same limit for everyone. And so, and it's obviously it has to be like high enough that it would work for everyone, but it had the same limit for everyone. And that was just consistent and easy to understand and simple, because what happens is, like, most everyday people living in the county, we can do all we can to educate people about this program, but the vast majority of people learn about these programs from the candidates who are asking them for money or organizations that they're connected to. And so if those candidates and organizations are like communicating different limits all the time, it is confusing for the everyday people versus everyone saying, you know, in the city's case, 350, 350, 350. It does like establish that clarity. I'm not saying that we should set it at 350. I'm just saying that like having one number for all races does have that benefit of being simple for people to understand. But that is, of course, your decision to make. And like some, you know, obviously a lot of communities feel like different limits are justified. So that is a decision for you all. Let's see what else stands out to me. Usually the self limits are higher. And so, you know, candidates can contribute a little bit more to themselves because there's not that fear of like the corrupting influence, if you will. Because, you know, you can't really be corrupt to yourself. Um, and then loan limits are usually higher. In the city of Portland, candidates could accept a loan of up to $5,000. And so loan limits are higher. Unfortunately, we have that constraint of the charter. So our loans cannot be higher than 603, unfortunately.
I'm sorry. A loan from an outside party can't be more than 603, but a loan from the candidate themselves personally could be higher, right?
I believe I'll check on your question. But I believe that like I think for the city, the loan was $5,000 and applied to anyone. So any individual, including the candidate themselves, could loan themselves $5,000.
I know that in the county right now, the loan limit is, I mean, Vadim Mazursky did, I think, $40,000 in loans to his campaign.
Well, I can look into that if you want and just like confirm that information.
Mm-hmm.
I can know that.
The interesting question becomes, if a person's elected, how long do they have to pay that loan back? I know, for example,
I'm sorry to interrupt. Go ahead.
At the federal level, it used to be the case that as of election day, the loan, if a candidate had loaned himself more than $250,000, everything above the 250 mark was converted to a contribution that could not be paid back, and only up to $250,000 of loan could be paid back after election day. Ted Cruz challenged that provision and was struck down by the Supreme Court. So now it's an unlimited amount, which can make a candidate feel a bit uncomfortable because now they're raising money from people. It's ostensibly for their campaign committee, but they know in their head it goes from the campaign committee right back into their own back pocket and feel a whole lot more like a personal donation to their own personal wallet. And I've talked to some candidates who have felt very deeply uncomfortable with that. So uncomfortable that they said, I'm never loaning money to my campaign again because that feels really wrong. It's one thing to raise money for my campaign that would be spent on mailers. The other thing to be spent money on my campaign that would be given to me, right? And even though it's a loan that was previously spent on mailers, right? It felt dirtier and grungier. So one of the questions is, what's the payback provisions on those loans? And again, if we're talking about $5,000, and I don't know, maybe it doesn't matter actually that much, but.
Yeah, great question. With the city, it was you had to pay it back by election day. So that was pretty straightforward.
So then it just becomes then that loan just becomes a cash flow management tool. I got to make payroll at the end of the month, so I loan my campaign money, we make payroll, then raise it, and we're done, right? It's another thing if it's going after election day.
Yeah, a lot of candidates like loan themselves money in the city program, just like build their website, for instance, or
right,
yeah, do those initial provisions. And you could use the matching funds to repay a loan too. So I think the bet was if I take this loan now, I'll get qualified for matching funds and I'll have more money to pay it back later. So, and that seemed to work out for most candidates, as far as I know. So these are the limits, and for other localities. And again, if you all want me to look into any other specific ones that aren't on this list, I'm happy to do so. And then below I have how the Portland small donor elections worked. $350 for all offices, as we talked about before. there was a seed funding provision, which was pretty popular, and candidates could accept up to $5,000 total in seed funds at the very big, at kind of earlier on, just to get their campaign up and running. But each donor was limited to $500. So like a donor could not provide a candidate $5,000 in seed funding, but 10 donors could each give the candidate $500, and then the campaign has accepted $5,000 in total. So the campaign had an aggregate limit for seed funding, and that was a pretty popular option for a lot of candidates to take. And we talked about the loan was $5,000, and then with organizations, most organizations could give up to $500 in seed funds as well. It's pretty like wide. What's I'm looking for? It was like pretty open in terms of who could give the seed funds, but in terms of beyond that, only small donor organizations could give $350 directly to a candidate. So I think like that was another aspect of how that program worked.
The county charter says individuals and political committees are the only allowable donors. No unions, no businesses, other nonprofits. Everybody else is excluded entirely, right?
Yeah, what the charter says is that, small donor committees, individuals, and political committees could give, and no other entity outside of that can give, which I'm not a lawyer, but I would bet would cover what you just said.
Corp LLCs, 501c3, C4s, 527s. Yeah, it's all the.
But all of those organizations can form a political action committee. It's
Right, exactly.
So there's literally no restriction on who can do those things because you just form a political action committee and you're fine.
Yeah, the S corp and LLC thing is interesting. Like in Florida, for example, Florida's political system is entirely dominated by real estate interests because every apartment building is a separate LLC, and so you have I think it's a $500 or $1,000 limit. So you find one one landlord who owns 20 buildings, he can give you 1,000 right, from every LLC, right?
That's funny. Hey, Daniel, I want to throw something before I forget it. And this was certainly an issue with the city of Portland, small donor elements, and I'm not sure how prevalent this is in the county, but I think it is something we need to think about, is the Oregon law requires that each one of these transactions is reported to Orstar, and most people use C&E systems to do that. That's pretty common. It became compounded when you're doing a $20 contribution. The cost to report that particular transaction, you're not seeing the full value of the $20 at that point, right? So this whole concept of, hey, let's go out and get $5 from somebody, really at that point you're not getting anything from somebody because the money was so small, right? And by the time you report it and the cost to report it and everything that goes along with that, so I'm not sure how, like, and maybe it's just something we keep in the back of our heads as we're looking at, potential of small donor contributions, is what is the cost to report those? Is there another mechanism to do that for candidates that have lots of small campaign contributions? Is there a way to do that? And that may be something that even has to get modified at the state level in order to make that work, because you still have reporting requirements that are required through Orstar. So something I definitely want to make sure we talk about on some level here.
Yeah, it's interesting. Oh, go ahead.
I'm not sure that's a problem we can solve. I mean, it is not difficult. I say this with all due respect to my friends who run C&E systems. It is not difficult to file your own reports, and the state system is pretty straightforward. You just go with your donations. What C&E systems is doing, of course, is a lot more than that. They're also running payroll for people. They're making sure you're hitting all your deadlines. They're advising people. They provide a valuable service, and that costs money. But I would say it's not a requirement. I think it's perfectly possible for people to not use them. I know quite a few city candidates that did not use C&E systems, and had a volunteer treasurer who did it for them. They provide a valuable service. They deserve to get paid for that service. I'm not sure there's a way for us to regulate that. Nor is there a way for us to, nor should we build a system that envisions like, well, gee, the first $4 of every donation goes off to the accounting firm. So therefore our limits ought to be like, I think it's more like we just got to make sure we're setting limits that are appropriate, again, so that people can raise the money they need to communicate and pay whatever their overhead expenses are, which in this case is accounting.
I do see what you're saying with that, but I'll also throw down that, where the whole purpose of this is a grassroots like entity. And if you are getting, lots of small contributions and you're trying to work a regular job and you're trying to run a campaign and you're trying to do all these things, all of a sudden, yes, that does become a challenge to get all of those reportings done on time, especially when the system, like for folks that are really familiar with it, may not be complicated, but especially for a new candidate, it is. So it is and I 100% agree with you. It's a valuable service and they absolutely do deserve to be paid for their services. However, when there's a big difference between going out and getting a $5,000 contribution that you have to report one time versus $1,005 contributions that you have to report 1,000 times. And that's the difference between the two and now all of a sudden that's a huge workload that it's thrown onto that candidate because we're trying to push them to these small dollar contributions.
Yeah.
That's the challenge in all of that.
Oh, for sure. No, I having spent 20 years of my life raising money in $5 and $10 increments, and hearing from people who at state legislative level, like it just doesn't make any sense for us to even start that program because it all goes back out the door to the accounting firm. And it's going to be a big rude awakening for state legislative candidates starting in 2027 when they discover that.
You're not wrong.
This was a conversation that came up a lot in the city's program. I think like not only just C&E, there were other treasurers out there too. And they felt like they had to charge the same amount for whether donation was $5 or $100 just because like it's the same amount of work. And so why do we charge less or more? But it was challenging for candidates because we were encouraging them to raise many small dollar donations. And then as you're talking about, Marshall, a portion of that was eaten up by treasury costs. And candidates would often look at their total revenue brought in, or like the profit, if you will, that were brought in. It was a lot smaller than what they expected just because of the treasury costs. So we do have on the full IEC agenda reporting requirements. I think it'd be a perfect place to talk about this. But it is a challenge to think about how can we make sure that candidates are still like, raising up to be competitive and reach out to voters if they're raising just small dollar donations. I think, and we'll be talking about this in our Monday meeting, but the method distribution is a part of it. So if you give candidates a matching funds, like, a 9-to-1 on whatever, then, candidates raising small dollar donations are getting less than matching funds that candidates are raising bigger donations. And if you're raising small dollar donations, then you're going to get a higher proportion of that eaten up by the treasury cost. And so that is a challenge to like doing this ratio matching system is it kind of does like, it causes some like consequences to candidates who are raising small donations. Some other programs do a grant-based system. It's like a flat, amount. And it's a healthy amount for candidates too. And that way you ensure that like all candidates have enough resources to be able to succeed, even if they are reliant on small dollar donations versus large donations. And then like, it's not as like detrimental to them. The treasury costs don't like hit them as hard too in that way.
Could we build a system that essentially says, go get 1,000 signatures from Portland residents or Multnomah County residents, and now you get a check for $10,000? Is that what you're describing?
I think some people do signatures. I think there's challenges with signatures, and we could talk about that on Monday. But some people do donations. A lot of, some grant programs where they do these block grants. So you have to raise like a certain amount of, money, or a certain, a number of donors have to give to you to then qualify for a block grant. But either way, like you are somehow proving that you have a degree of popular support in order to qualify for a block grant.
Think about that signature model, which then gets to Marshall's thought about this should be about grassroots organizing, and it gets you out of everything I just raised got eaten up by treasury costs, right? And maybe once you clear that, you get that first 10,000, that's your seed money, right? and then from there you raise money and you get matching, whatever else you do. But like, there's a way to convert signatures, and maybe there's within a time frame. It's
Yeah.
It's got to be within 90 days out from election day or something. You got to do that, like some kind of system where you can. I don't know. I'm trying to think creatively here about how do we drive grassroots behavior, make sure people are having conversations out there, not shoot up on treasury costs, give people enough money to run their campaigns.
Yeah, I'd say like if we can table this for Monday, because it is a very relevant part of the conversation, we definitely need to like get into it. But I have a meeting at 10.
So do I. We have 5 minutes left. So Daniel, I'm not sure we got to the review of policy options part of your agenda, or maybe we would talk about the whole time policy options. But I think it'd be helpful for ahead of our next meeting, Daniel, if you could sort of identify for us what are the like questions we need to answer, and if those are open-ended or multiple choice, or multiple choice with another, that might help structure this conversation here, so we can like kind of knock off some easy ones, right?
Well, I think I'm happy to do it, but I did put a list of questions at the very top of the fact sheet. It's called key questions, and it just has like some of them written down. I'm happy to like go into greater detail or like get you specific questions though if you like beyond that. Are there questions beyond that list that you want me to like prioritize?
Maybe not.
I guess
So on Monday we're talking about matching.
We're talking about method of distribution. So do we give out ratio match? Do we give out grants? Do we do vouchers? Like one of those options.
Yeah, that'll really inform our answers to those questions.
Totally. Yeah.
It seems like, Daniel, in your questions, I have it pulled up on my screen here, that a lot of these, like contribution limits for small donor committees, we can't change that number. I mean, we can lower it. I'm certainly not in favor of lowering anything because that doesn't work. But I do feel very restricted in what if we can't go above, what's already in charter. I mean, I feel like we're kind of on the same page on this, that there's not enough money coming in for candidates to run their campaigns. So like if we're cut off from changing those numbers, then I mean, is the recommendation for the county commissioners to go and change or throw that out for a vote or what that might be? I mean, that's and I don't know what the right answer to that is, but I feel like there's some built-in restrictions into what we can even recommend if we can't change these things. Other than I mean, I'm pretty certain I'm not in favor of lowering anything. So that's just where I'm at with this stuff. I don't think there's enough money from the campaign contribution side coming into the campaigns. And I certainly don't trust the county to come up with the budgets to match funds. We saw what a dumpster fire that was in the city of Portland. So to me, something's got to give in all of that somewhere. Otherwise, we're just going to have all campaigns are going to be independent expenditures, and that'll just be the new world. I mean, which I really don't want to see that driven in that direction. I think that's a terrible way of doing it.
For what it's worth, the city's limit was 350, which was clearly too tight. The county's limit is 603. I still think it's probably still also too tight, but it's not as bad as 350. Of course, county races are much larger than city races. So that's an interesting challenge. I think Marshall will probably in this situation, we got to build the best system we can under these limits and then make a recommendation to the county commission that says, and we recommend that you put before the voters something that says we're going to limit it to the state and federal level. Like let's harmonize all the way down. Federal, state, and now county is all at 3,300 in 2020.
That would make me very happy if we got it. But I do have a hard stop at 10 o'clock today, guys. So
10.
See you on Monday, and like we'll have an agenda for next time. But like, I just want to give you that like these are the constraints we're working under, and like the
very much appreciate it.
Super helpful today. Thank you.
Yeah, great. Okay, thanks so much, everybody.
Thanks, guys.